Welcome back to the Rory Talks Football channel, your daily Arsenal news, updates, debates and my opinions. If you're new to the channel, please do subscribe. Bottom right hand corner, we're trying to get to 6,000 subscribers. Smash a like on the video if you enjoy it as well. We're talking January transfers. Might seem a bit premature, probably is a bit premature, but it's the international break. I'm bored out of my brain. I'm actually going to Wembley tonight, but I am bored out of my brain. And lots of people have started talking about January transfers and possible January transfers, and we'll go through a few of them, or a couple of them. Basically, we're going through Ivan Toney, Pedro Neto, and then a little gem, an outside bet that I would quite like, and I'll talk you through that player later in the video. But we'll start with Ivan Toney, who is suspended at the moment, of course, has been suspended all season, but he's back in training. I think he actually played in a behind-closed-doors friendly during the international break, and come January will be available to play. Now, the reason that he's such a big topic of conversation, first of all, is to do with himself and his agent kind of trying to push the Arsenal move. I think that's clear. You look at the interview that he did with Stephen Bartlett on the Diary of a CEO podcast, where Bartlett kind of prompted him to say that he's a Liverpool fan and to talk about Liverpool, and he almost awkwardly moved the conversation to talk about how he is such a fan of Arsenal. Not a supporter of Arsenal, but loves the way that we're playing and stuff. And his agent has been pushing that narrative as well. So I think that's one of the reasons that there's been a lot of talk about it. And the other is that people draw comparisons between Arsenal and Man City. And of course, last season, a big difference maker for Man City was Erling Haaland, and it's lots of people talk about the fact that Arsenal need that goal scorer. They need that number 9 that's going to bag 30 goals a season, and we don't have that. And Jesus isn't that. So I can understand why Ivan Toney's topic of conversation. I can understand the arguments for him. I can understand the arguments against him. There is an argument that whilst Ivan Toney could come in and score lots of goals, what happens to goals elsewhere on the pitch? We had our highest goal-scoring season ever in Premier League history last season, and it wasn't because we had a 30-goal-a-season striker. It was because Saka got over 10 goals, Martinelli got over 10 goals, Ødegaard got over 10 goals, Xhaka got 8 goals. There were goals coming from all around the park, and someone like Jesus facilitates that. So we'll look into it. So the headline stats from last season: Toney plays 33 games, scores 20 goals, gets 4 assists. Jesus plays 26 games, obviously had that big injury, scores 11 goals and has 6 assists. So that plays into Ivan Toney is a better goal scorer. Fair enough. Move on. Goals per match backs that up. Minutes per goal backs that up. Shots, has more shots on target. Fair enough. All backs it up. Interestingly, Jesus actually has a slightly higher shooting accuracy. However, shooting percent success, far more on Ivan Toney's side. So whilst fewer of his shots are on target as a percentage, the ones that are on target are more likely to go in. However, you do caveat that by saying Ivan Toney scored 6 penalties last season and Jesus only scored 1. So if you go back to those headline stats, it's actually 14 non-penalty goals compared to 10 non-penalty goals. Then you consider how many games they played. It's closer than that first 20 goals versus 11 goals makes it look. This is where it gets kind of into the narrative that people have, that Jesus misses too many chances, and this definitely backs it up. 16 big chances missed each. But Toney scored 17 of his big chances, and Jesus only scored 10. And arguably, Ivan Toney got unlucky, or more unlucky, by hitting the woodwork more times. And that is a big thing. Toney scored more of the big chances than he missed, and Jesus missed considerably more than he scored. That is a problem. And it, to be fair, has always been a problem through Jesus' career. This I find interesting, though, because this goes against a bit of a narrative, that narrative I spoke about, of the idea that Jesus is more of a player that's going to create chances for the players around him. This doesn't directly prove that to be true. Yes, Jesus had more assists, 6 compared to 4, but actually Ivan Toney created double the number of big chances that Jesus created last season. It just so happened that the 6 big chances created by Jesus, he ended up with 6 assists. Ivan Toney, 4 assists from 12 big chances created. And that is almost entirely down to the players around them. Jesus has Martinelli, Saka, Ødegaard around him. Ivan Toney has players like Mbeumo around him, who just isn't a clinical goal scorer. So you can look at that and say, well, you bring Ivan Toney into a team with Martinelli and Saka and Ødegaard around him, those big chances will become more goals, and you'll look at his assist numbers rocket. And that really does go against the narrative that Toney's only there to score goals. pass completion. That is one that Jesus really does hammer Ivan Toney on, and that pass completion isn't great for Ivan Toney. But again, I feel like more often than not, it's a long ball up to Ivan Toney, and if he wins it and heads it down, it's much harder to make sure that goes to a fellow teammate. The final one, and again, this kind of goes against the narrative against Toney being a provider and a creator. 34 crosses into the box compared to 11 for Jesus. 12 through balls. And again, that's where you're seeing runners coming off him like Mbeumo. We've got Martinelli to do that, but far more often than not, Martinelli will score the goals that Mbeumo doesn't. And also, Ivan Toney dispossessed quite a few fewer times than Jesus, which again, partly down to the fact that Jesus tries to take on a man and Ivan Toney doesn't do it as much. But again, it's a good sign for Ivan Toney. So ultimately, Pedro Neto, coming on to him shortly, ultimately, I think Ivan Toney could be a very good signing for us. And I think he offers something different. I think some of the things that are thrown at Ivan Toney in terms of will he provide the goals that Jesus can provide, I actually think he is capable of doing that. He is a more clinical striker. And so there's real reason to say, look, you can bring Ivan Toney in and he is good enough to start games. Of course, he also provides that alternative option to Jesus in terms of the long ball. I mean, I have never, ever seen a player dominate Saliba and Gabriel in the way that Ivan Toney did at the Emirates last season. And the mouth-watering thing almost about that is, even Erling Haaland's not capable of doing it, but Ivan Toney did. He won every single aerial duel against Saliba last season at the Emirates, and it was that link-up between Raya and Ivan Toney. So bringing that to Arsenal, that is, I like it. I like it. Ivan Toney also has an exceptional injury record. He's not been injured since the 15-16 season. 27 years old, he's in his prime. Bit of a late bloomer, but I think he's hit that now. And so there are a lot of reasons that I think Ivan Toney would be a fantastic signing. If you want to be negative, not even negative, if you want to, add a bit of realistic interpretation to it, is it possible to do it in January? Potentially not. Reasons being we are tied by FFP quite tightly at the moment. He's a very expensive signing, and you'd have to do something a bit like we did with Raya, where you delay the FFP. You can amortize his contract, whatever, over 5 years, possibly. You could maybe put in Nketiah in a deal going the other way. But what you can't do, I don't think, is loan him, because I don't think you can have two players on loan from the same club. So, look, it'll be interesting. He would be a massive, massive addition to the squad. People say, well, you're not going to spend that much money on a player that doesn't start. Look at Kai Havertz. Kai Havertz is proof that we are willing to go out and spend that sort of money on players that aren't guaranteed starting spots. So, Ivan Toney, I would love him. Do I think it's possible in January? Possibly not. But there you go. Pedro Neto, he's the other one that people are talking about. Now, he's come much more back onto people's radar this season because he's looked electric at the start of the season. He can play off both sides. He has that pace where I feel like outside of Reece Nelson, we don't really have anyone that can come in for Gabriel Martinelli that provides that raw pace. And I think it's such a threat. It makes you such a threat. We saw it against City, the difference it made when Martinelli came on, the way it pushed Kyle Walker back. I think it's a huge thing to have. And having someone like Pedro Neto that can do that off either side, I think would be really important for us. Now, Pedro Neto's stats, I've compared Pedro Neto's entire Premier League career to Martinelli last season, right? Because for me, Pedro Neto is someone that would come into as a backup to Martinelli or Bukayo Saka. And the numbers aren't amazing, 10 goals in 99 appearances compared to 15 in 36 last season for Martinelli. But he does have considerably more assists, 15-5. Obviously, the goals per match, very low. Minutes per goal, very low. Has had, obviously, a lot more shots in that time. Shots on target, only slightly more. Far more shots off target, far lower shooting accuracy than Martinelli, and a far lower shooting success percentage than Martinelli. Big chances scored, more for Martinelli. Big chances missed, more for Pedro Neto. That's worrying. That is worrying. That of 14 big chances, Pedro Neto's only scored 4 of them. Of 16 big chances, Martinelli scored 10 of them. Now, one thing I do think you have to say there, Martinelli is unbelievably clinical. It's one part of his game I don't think he is given anywhere near enough credit for. I'd argue Martinelli is probably the most clinical finisher at Arsenal, and I don't think people respect that. But that's a different conversation. Then you come to the other side of the game, creating chances. 15 assists compared to 5. Obviously, he's played far more games, but he's actually only had double the number of starts that Martinelli had last season because of those injuries and stuff. So he does create more. That's a fact. More big chances created, better pass completion rate. So that side of his game, I would argue, he's better than Martinelli, and that would be a big addition to the squad. Puts in lots of crosses, which again, there's no way we get Neto and Ivan Toney, but that would be beautiful. And dispossessed more times, but I think in terms of games played, that works out pretty evenly. And that's it. That's all I've done for Pedro Neto. Now, the big issue for Pedro Neto is injury history. That being, he spent almost all of last season out with a knee injury. He spent a lot of the season before that out with an ankle injury. And, other way around. He spent a lot of last season out with an ankle injury, season before knee injury. At his age, that's 2 big injuries to have had that could have long-term repercussions, if you compare that to Ivan Toney. It is a worry, especially the way that we've seen, even players that have a good injury history coming at Arsenal. It's just a worry. We don't have a great track record of it. But having said that, I think Pedro Neto is an option. I do think he's an option. Would I go for him? I keep umming and ahhing about it. The thing with Pedro Neto, right, is that he comes in as a direct replacement for Saka or for Gabriel Martinelli. And I do worry that Bukayo Saka, off the right-hand side, we don't have a proper backup for him. And in the sense, and what I actually mean by that is that Gabriel Jesus can play off the right. But if Gabriel Jesus plays off the right, I don't think Nketiah is good enough. I think my overwhelming point is that I don't think Nketiah is good enough. And Nketiah has started 5 or 6 games in the Premier League so far this season. And for me, he's not good enough. So whether you bring in Ivan Toney, which actually means if Saka gets injured, you start Ivan Toney and Jesus can play off the right, or you bring in Pedro Neto and then you can have Jesus through the middle. You don't have to worry about moving Jesus out to the right if Saka gets injured. I just think either one of these signings, the big thing it changes is that you're no longer relying on Eddie Nketiah coming in. If we have one injury, basically one injury across the front 3, it seems like Nketiah comes in. That's a problem. And then finally, this is the gem that I want to talk about. Antonio Nusa. Have you heard of him? Plays for Club Bruges, 18 years old, right-footed, can play off the left or the right-hand side. His SofaScore rating so far this season, 7.97 average. To put that into context, only James Maddison and Rodri have a higher average SofaScore rating so far this season in the Premier League than Antonio Nusa does at Club Bruges. Obviously, he is only 18. He's only played, I think, 6 games. So it's a small data pool to go from. But he is a very, very promising young player. By the way, SofaScore, you can actually download SofaScore using the link in my bio, in the description. Massively helps me out if you download it. So feel free to. Ben Mattinson, who is top content creator on Twitter, does threads on star players, prospects, stuff like that. I will leave a link to this entire thread on Antonio Nusa in the description, but I've taken just a few snippets from it, which I'm sure he won't mind. These are some of the numbers that Antonio Nusa is putting up in the Belgian Pro League so far this season. Top 1% for take-ons attempted. Top 1% for successful take-ons. Top 2% for take-on success. Top 1% for progressive carries. Top 8% for carries into the final third. Top 1% for carries into the penalty area. What you are looking at here is a player that you get the ball to him on the right or the left-hand side, the ball ends up in the box. He gets past his man, he gets into the box. Top 1% for progressive passes, received at 14.35 per game, which shows how much his team is looking to get the ball out to him, and he's good at finding that space to receive the ball. And 5.59 shot-creating actions per 90. That puts him in the top 4%. And Ben says he's a decisive winger, capable of moments. And then finally, the defensive aspect of his game. 1.34 dribblers tackled, that puts him in the top 1%. 2.92 dribblers challenged, puts him in the top 3%. 45.8% of dribblers tackled, puts him in the top 17%. And 1.7 tackles won, puts him in the top 2%. Who does that remind you of? Gabriel Martinelli. That defensive work rate that we look for, that Arteta looks for in our wingers, he's got that. So that was just one I thought I'd throw in because I feel like we have another Marquinhos in us. And the reason I say that is that I don't think Marquinhos is going to work. Marquinhos is on loan at Nantes in the French league this season. I think he's played a combined 89 minutes of football for them this season. So that's one that hasn't worked out particularly well. This one might be slightly more expensive, but just a little one to keep your eye on. And like I said, go and follow Ben because he drops quite a few of these, and they're interesting players to look into for the future. But there you go. That's a bit of a wrap of the players that we might be going for in January. In reality, I actually think it will come a lot more down to who's injured come January and also who we can sell. Do we get rid of Smith Rowe? Do we get rid of Nketiah? There are questions to be asked, but we'll talk about that in the future. For now, like I said, please do subscribe, smash a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and I will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.